Welcome back, everybody. It is Sunday, January 5th, kind of late in the afternoon, evening actually, about 8 o'clock. I'm slowly plugging away on the USACC build, the 68 Dodge Charger. I put the lift blocks on the rear axle, and that made the shock struts that are in the kit a little too short. So I decided to scratch build some shock struts and use pieces of the original parts, which, if you haven't seen it today, Matthew Inman at Model Car Videos had Tim Kalankowitz, Tim K of Tim Custom Models, over at his shop. They did a little video on scratch building. Matthew was having some trouble creating the frame for a tubbed out rear end on the project he's working on. So Tim came over and gave him a few little tips. And I've been doing a little more scratch building lately, more than I've ever really done. And yeah, you kind of get into it a little bit, but you got to have good reference material. I mean, you can make stuff up, sure. But in a case like this with the USACC build, you want it to look as authentic as you can. So that's what I'm working on. And I'll show you here what I did to make the struts. All right, hold on. All right, because of the modification I made to the leaf springs to lift the back end, we moved our axle shaft from above the leaf springs to below and added a lift block in between. And the lift block was placed in an area. There was already a flat spot there where the shock struts in the kit were supposed to attach, right? So now that we've raised the back end, the shock struts are too short to reach, and they had these little pads on the end that were, so this was all one piece like that. This was all attached. Well, I guess it was attached here. All right, so the first thing I did was cut off the pad because I knew it wasn't going to fit in the original location anymore. And then what I've got here, I think that's 16th inch brass tubing and 5/32 inch plastic tubing, polystyrene tubing from Evergreen. And what I had to do was use these micro drill bits. The white one's slightly smaller than the pink, and I had to take the end of this 3/32 tubing and widen it up a little more so that my brass tubing would fit inside of it. All right, so now I've got two new shock struts that are longer. All right, and then what I'm doing on top of that is, bring this back over here, I've cut off the top end of the strut, the connection point, this would be, what do you call that? Like the eye, the end of the strut, right? So your bolt goes through and it's got a bit of a swivel in it, and your bushing, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that away from the rest of the pad, and then I will drill a smaller hole in the end of it to attach it and pin it basically into the strut. And then I'll do the same thing with the opposite end. We'll cut off that attachment point and pin it and glue it to the aft end of the strut. And right now, of course, that's a flat open hole. This connector will help cover that hole with the pin. And then I'll have to use probably a nail file or even this flat rat tail file to go in and create a bit of an arc at the end of this to make it look a little bit more rounded over like the kit part is. See, it's square right now. Square is in this way, whereas the kit part is slightly rounded over at the butt end. So that's what I'm working on here. Not difficult, just takes a little bit of planning and time. And these struts will be should be long enough to account for the block and the movement of the axle shaft. So the axle shaft was up here. It's now below and lifted slightly more away from the leaf spring. All right, there we have it. 2 new shock struts. The eye on the opposite end, when I cut those off, they're so small there really wasn't enough there to drill into to peg it. So what I ended up doing was with the 1/16 brass rod, like I used for the inner portion of that strut, I just cut off like an 1/8 inch, well, not an 1/8 inch, about a 1/16 of an inch piece of that, and then super glued it onto the end of the plastic tubing. So once this is all painted, it'll look much more the part than it does at the moment, although you can see we got quite a bit more length out of it. So if you were to put these side by side, you can see, you know, probably another 1/4 of an inch longer than the original kit piece, even if it was all in one piece still. So that should work well for us. And all I got to do now is paint it. The interior portion of the strut will get a chrome paint. I'll actually probably do that with a Molotow pen. Everything else will just get the flat black. Probably, I don't know. I may do a yellow or a blue. I got to do some research, see what colors were most prevalent back in the day. But there you have it. And lastly, before I go, I had a few things already painted, specifically the bottom of the car, the chassis and the frame, belly pans. And I had used semi-gloss black, which is, it's pretty standard for that. The kit calls for that. But I was looking at one of the reference photos I'm using of a real car, and it looked a little more gray to me. So I decided to repaint it, and what I used is Tamiya's XF69 NATO black, right? Come on. Well, anyway, NATO black. And like I said, it's really more of a dark gray, but it does look a lot closer to what I was seeing in my reference photo. Now, of course, I still have to paint the fuel tank. That'll get more of an aluminum steel kind of color. And I'm debating, there are molded in brake lines, fuel lines, I'm not sure. I might actually try to plumb this thing. And then the front clip, that remains in the semi-gloss black. I just think it looks better that way. So yeah, a little bit there. And on our rear end, so I don't know, I hope that's showing up in focus. Anyway, so we've got our lift box in between the spring and the axle. Everything's painted. And the other thing I did, I modified the ends where the wheels attach. So in the kit, so you got the round end of the axle, and then on that round end, there are 2 like half rounds with a split in the middle. And basically the wheel slides onto that and kind of snaps in. Well, I'm not using the kit wheels, obviously. I'm using some MCB Products wheels. And on the back side of those, there's a indentation, if you will, that's 1/16 of an inch. So what I did was I cut those little nibs off that would attach to the wheel, and then drilled into the end of the axle and widened it out enough to use a bit of 1/16 outside diameter aluminum tubing. So those little bits of tubing now, and there's about a 1/16 of an inch hanging out on each end. That's what my wheels will attach to now when I get to that point. And what else have I done? I did get the trunk hinge glued in, so it is on. I might need to redo the actual hinge part, because what I'm noticing, and I didn't notice this before I glued it all together, is that my bend in my hinge isn't wide enough. So when it comes up, it's starting to hit in these corners. And when it does that, the trunk lid itself is lifting up and out. So when you push it back down, you end up getting this big gap. So what I need to do is probably rebend this portion of it, so that 90-degree bend right there is further away from the back of the trunk there. And that should solve it, because then it can rotate without hitting anything. At least I think that's where my issue is. I may have to look at it a little closer, but I think that's the issue I'm having. And the doors. I keep looking at reference photos. I think I have an idea of how I'm going to proceed with the hinges on those. I'm going to try to replicate it more authentically than what I've seen done by some others. I tried to do the technique that A4 Garage does with his hinges, and I just don't have the right materials. My solder would not stick to the materials I was using. Apparently tin doesn't hold on to solder very well, because I think there is tin in solder, I believe. I don't know. Anyway, that didn't work out, so I've got to readdress that. And I think I'm going to end up using pieces of evergreen styrene, square tubing, and maybe some angle tubing, or angle tubing. It's not angle tubing, it's just angle. So square tubing and angle, we'll see. And maybe some pinned hinges on that. Yeah, it's slow. I haven't been spending as much time in the shop as I would like. I'm spending a little more time nurturing a new relationship. And you know how that can be. You have to spend more time with her than you do with your mistress, as it were. But anyway, stick around. We're gonna get there eventually. And yeah, 2025 is turning out to be a banger. Peace and love, y'all.